listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson, and joining me this week, I have a massive guest who I have been very excited to get on the podcast for a long time. And I suppose I'll introduce him right away. I've got the very famous and I'd say probably extremely impartial independent journalist Michael West here on the episode today, joining me to discuss what is a very consequential issue in Australian politics at the moment, which is the issue of foreign interference in our politics and I suppose more broadly our culture. But for the purpose of this episode, I think we'll mainly stick to discussing how specifically the nation of Israel influences Australian politics. I'm sure Michael will go into it a little bit when we get started, but of course, this is a very controversial topic, so we may have to be a bit careful how we say things just for the sake of YouTube. But nonetheless, it is a topic that needs to be discussed thoroughly and honestly, I believe, if we are to see any real solutions to the problems, which I'm sure we will discuss throughout the episode. So, without further ado, thank you for coming on, Michael. And would you like to tell us a little bit just about your history in journalism and also how your interest in this specific topic of Israel? I mean, you speak about many topics, but this specific issue, why it's important to you and how your interest developed in it.
G'day, John. Pleasure to be on the show. Well, just the potted rundown is that I've been a journalist for about 30 years, independent, Michael West Media now we're coming into our 10th year soon, so it seems like a lifetime. But I started out as a cadet on the Australian Financial Review, a couple of years there, 5 years on the Herald when it was back in the Fairfax days. I went into stockbroking for a couple of years, where I was the world's worst stockbroker, but it was good to see how that gravy train worked, so that it gave me the edge when I got back into journalism, because I'd actually been in the industry. So I got poached to go back to the Australian to work at Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. I was a columnist, had a daily column for 5 years, and then did some investigative stuff and had a weekly column after that. Then poached to go back to Fairfax, where I lasted another 8 years, and then into independent media, which has been quite a trip because, the whole business model, once in a century sort of industrial revolution the digital revolution in journalism is, it's completely undermined the traditional business model, the rivers of gold or the rivers of silver. And because search gets all the money now, which is Google, and the platforms get the money, not the media organizations, the content producers. So what we do is we just do the journalism and chop it out across all the platforms.
Well, thank goodness for this, the digital revolution, as you so described it. I mean, without that, we'd have extremely centralized media. We wouldn't be able to hear these sort of, I suppose, dissident narratives, especially concerning topics such as the issue of Israel's influence in Australia. You can go about this any way you like, but would you like to let us know, maybe you could tell us about how you came to be aware of Israeli influence in Australian media or politics, or just generally how you came to notice this interference in our society, I suppose.
Well, obviously things completely took off on October 7, 2023, from an Australian point of view as well, because of our alliances to America and to Israel. It's become even this week, it seems to be still peaking. It seems to get even more. This week, convening the National Cabinet after pressure from the Zionist orgs to deal with anti-Semitism as an issue. It's now huge in domestic politics. It's going to play a significant part in this election. I think coming up, say May, it is an enormous global issue. It's very sad to see what's happening, but broadly, I don't hold out a lot of hope for any kind of resolution very soon, because, of course, Netanyahu and company are still in charge in Israel, and that's everything sort of ripples out from there. And, of course, as long as they're in charge, the Zionist organisations here, all of them, basically they've got a position. It's an unwritten rule that they never criticise the government of Israel. And unfortunately, this government of Israel is to put it in very layman's terms, has overcooked it. And so the Israel lobby here has overcooked their response. And the fact that the ceasefire, which was forced upon Israel by Trump, who wanted things a bit cleaner for his inauguration, that has really angered the aggressive types in the pro-Israel lobby and their acolytes on social media even more. Because here they were, the aims of the war were to get rid of Hamas and to get the hostages back. Well, there's a deal now to get the hostages back, but Hamas looks to be as strong as ever. Criticism of Israel is growing. They're a global pariah state now. And I think it's very difficult for politicians here, given the influence of the Israel lobby, to just call a spade and say, look, you guys have overcooked it. It's causing division in Australian society. That's not all the fault of the Zionists. I mean, there are some radical people on the right and the left that are probably anti-Semitic. But the problem is they conflate anti-Semitism with legitimate anti-Israel criticism, because Israel has just been engaged in so many atrocities and so many war crimes for the past 16 months that to blame anybody else but themselves and their own lobbies is a bit rich.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've seen the weaponization of this term anti-Semitism to such an extent that really it's lost all value, like many other political labels that get bandied around. But specifically this one, I mean, especially in recent times, we've seen, although we've seen a recent spat of vandalism and various crimes which are labeled under they're supposedly anti-Semitic hate crimes, things like that. We're still yet to receive really any answers on the culprits for a lot of these crimes. And the question is still up in the air as to, who stands to benefit and who might have perpetrated something like that. Nonetheless, the term has been, especially, I think, devalued because of that. You can take whatever view you want on the use of the term, but I agree that it's been overused, and it really has been sort of pushed down the throats of many of Australians who, frankly, have no concern one way or the other about the conflict. Perhaps they lean towards having a more humanitarian perspective on the whole. Nonetheless, all we've seen is war-to-war coverage on anti-Semitism when we have several other concerns in our own country, and of course, it's not the only issue. So I'll ask you, Michael, why do we hear such wall-to-wall coverage about the Israel issue in Australia?
Well, they do tend to make it about themselves as Zionists. I mean, a lot of it is indoctrination, because, they've been taught there is this chosen people thing from birth and this cult of persecution that, unfortunately, they're trashing the memory of the Holocaust because they've exploited it for victimization. It's a formula that's worked for a lot of years for them. They managed to get special treatment and set up all these charities. They're actual charities with the ACNC, the regulator, and we're subsidising a lot of this stuff. And the most extreme of them is probably the AJA, the Australian Jewish Association, which is a problem for Zionists because they've appropriated the word Jewish. They purport to talk for all Jews, but they don't, because we know they're a decent Jewish, pro-peace, pro-Palestinian people, and pro-Israel as well, two-state solution, who are decent, who go on the marches on the weekends and who, stand up and be counted on social media and so on, despite all the pressure that's sort of being called self-loathing Jews and this kind of nonsense. So, from my Jewish friends, I understand that, in families, brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, there's been, there's a lot of tension for the Jewish community, which we don't see if we're not in it. But suffice to say, if you're a lobby group, you call yourself the Australian Jewish Association, if you look at their Twitter feed, they sit there all day basically promoting Muslim and Arab hatred. Now, I don't know how the government allows this to be a registered charity, and I've been on to Andrew Lee about it, the minister in the Labor government who's responsible for the Charities Not-for-Profits Commission. It's in his portfolio. And I think, like everybody else, the problem is that he doesn't want to be called anti-Semitic, because he'll get an onslaught of criticism, because anybody that criticises the government of Israel is called anti-Semitic. I mean, they've called Amnesty International, the UN, the UNHCR, the General Assembly, they've called every major charity, the Red Cross, everybody apparently is anti-Semitic. And so this is the problem, as you say, it has been overused. They've overcooked it. They've told too many lies, because they've got this thing going called Hasbara, which means that you might not be fighting with the IDF on the front, but as a Zionist, you have a duty to fight in the media or in whatever field you're in for the state of Israel. And, the problem with that is that there's this idea that it doesn't really matter if you tell the truth. It's a means to an end kind of proposition. And so it doesn't really matter whether you abuse people and say really nasty things and dox them and get them to lose their jobs. You see, we've got a lot of first-hand experience of this, because having been in the mainstream media, I sort of know the way the mainstream has been cowed by the Israel lobby. And being independent, I don't have to worry about. There's only one person who can sack me, and that's myself. So I can say whatever I want. I mean, obviously, I'm subject to constant criticism and legal threats and things, but I'm independent enough to do things, not just regarding Israel, but any kind of big business type of thing, which is too difficult for mainstream media to go into for political reasons to investigate. In my view, it's the biggest fail I've ever seen in my 30 years in journalism, the failure to cover the genocide. It is an absolutely abysmal failure. I mean, I knew there'd be a lot of pressure, but I just didn't think worldwide the mainstream media would be so bad, would miss the story of the century, to the point of just running straight Israel government IDF propaganda, not talking to the other side, not even bothering to go and get voices on the other side. And if you talk to the people who are close to the Palestinian communities, the community leaders, because they've come to me wringing their hands, saying, look, I can't get a story in the Herald, I can't get a story in the Australian, can't get a story in the Guardian. Nobody will run our stories when we've got actual relatives who are victims who are dying over there. And they can't, because, of course, all the media apparatus here is dead set scared of putting a foot out of line, lest they be called anti-Semitic. If you look what happened to Antoinette Lattouf and others, the journalists themselves, to give them credit, it's not their fault, it's the bosses, it's the leadership of these places. The journalists themselves, they've written letters to management and said, look, this is disgraceful the way we're covering this. What about some fair, proper journalism? And of course, they just get told to shut up. And there's nowhere to go these days because the media is shrinking, the business model's not there. So they don't have that robust independence, or more robust independence that they used to have. And at the same time, you've got this proliferation across the platforms of everyone's a publisher now having their own say. And so they haven't been able to contain it, because the internet's like the blob. If you punch it in one place, it sort of bulges out in the other. They've just shut down Twitter TikTok in the US, the TikTok ban, and all these people are flooded over to the Chinese app, Red Cape or Redneck or whatever it's called. So, you can't really beat it. And the live streaming of the atrocities out of Gaza has really made it a huge problem. And now with you'd have to call it massive failure of Israel to beat Hamas militarily. These guys with low-tech guys in tunnels, obviously, determined and very good fighters. I mean, the siege mentality now in the Zionist community is bad. I mean, they've lost their reputation globally. Everyone's onto them now, so looking at all the lies and just tired of hearing anti-Semitism the whole time. And I think it's making them more extreme. So the only solution really is to resolve the conflict in the Middle East and for just tempers to calm down, because, at the end of the day, it's, the world should be about love and peace and people getting on with each other, not fighting. And death and war and mutilation just begets more death, war, and mutilation. It's as simple as that. And it's spread to almost every country in the world. The Hasbara or propaganda war, and Israel is losing it, frankly. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism is on the rise, not just criticism of the government of Israel, and it will continue to rise. We said this on YouTube. We got an absolute thrashing on YouTube from the trolls when we first said this. We did a video on it a couple of months after, maybe a month after October 7, when you could see the brutality, the reaction, the response from the IDF, from Netanyahu. And we just predicted it, that if they went on like this, then anti-Semitism would rise and it would be their fault. And then I did another thing on YouTube. I got up one day feeling particularly strongly about it, and it was one of the best audience things we've ever done. It was quite long for my usual stuff, and just about how Israel had lost the war. And that was 6 months ago. So I think Israel lost this war a long time ago, because it's not about how many people you kill. It's about how you come out of it politically. Well, although they've still got a stranglehold on the leadership in many Western countries, Spain and Ireland and so on, it's slipping away. They still control the American process through IPAC, and in Australia, they've got a lot of influence. But, the longer it goes on, the more strained that will become. And I think that's what we're seeing the manifestation of now in the Australian polity. We're seeing extreme tensions and extreme pressure on the government to, the problem though is when they have an anti-Semitism, they're calling now for judicial inquiries, the Zionist lobby. But the problem is, it's such an own goal, everything they've done, because by making such a fuss and being so unreasonable and never criticising Israel, despite the daily atrocities that people can see on their telephones, this hysterical victimhood narrative that they go on with, when they're, as far as I keep on asking people on X when I get attacked, well, can you name one person that's been physically, even had one hair on their head, ruffled due to an anti-Semitic incident? And people can't, because there's been no violence. And now they're trying to reposition the narrative that somebody with a can of spray paint, and as you alluded, we don't know who's doing a lot of this stuff. It could be false flag. And a lot of people, because of all the lies now, are treating these things with huge suspicion, like the Melbourne synagogue, the Adas Israel synagogue firebombing. We're almost up to 50 days and no culprit's been. They've got CCTV footage. Why don't they show it? We don't know who the perpetrators are, but now they're saying that people who do graffiti are terrorists. It's an act of terrorism to do political expression by way of spray paint. And that's pretty radical, calling people terrorists because they say, F Israel on a wall somewhere. I wouldn't do it myself, but, protest movement and freedom of speech is legitimate. Graffiti is, upsets a lot of people, but, 50,000 people at least, as they're still pulling bodies out from under the rubble now that they're allowed to go back to their homes. But, how many people have really died there? They're saying 45,000 or thereabouts, but, other estimates have got it at 200. Compared to no injuries in Australia, and there's this hysterical victimhood narrative. And the Jews that I know, they're fine. They don't feel threatened living in Australia. I've got three of my reporters. I'd have the most highest level of Jewish people working with me of any media organisation. Yaakov, Marcus, and Zach, three very good Jewish reporters who work with me, and I haven't heard them say they feel endangered. So it is propaganda. It's overcooked, and the more they overcook it, the more suspicious people become, and they just say, Aussies don't like whingers, and it's extreme hysterical whinging to complain about all these things, and especially jumping to the conclusion that it's a Muslim or an Arab or a leftist or whatever it is, before you even know or Nazi or whatever, before you know who the perpetrator is. There was one today, wasn't there, that in the Newtown synagogue graffiti, somebody's been arrested, but they won't divulge the names. Now, it just creates more suspicion. And then the AFP Commissioner, Reece Kershaw, came out and said that he thought that some of these acts were promoted by or organised by foreign parties, to get to your foreign interference thing. The AFP Commissioner said it, foreign parties paying people in Bitcoin in Australia to do these acts of political aggression. And so,
Well, I don't think it's Hamas that has money lying around to pay for graffiti in Australia or vandalism in Australia. So I suspect other parties are at fault in that circumstance.
well, who knows who it is, but the fact is the politicians and everybody in the media is all jumping on the terrorism, anti-Semitism wagon, but we don't even know who it is. I mean, and Mossad, of course, is the speculation all over social media, because of course Mossad has a long history of false flag operations, and so it's reasonable that that speculation should happen. But I mean, the fact is, who knows? But it's being used for political purposes, and the charities are being used against the rules of the ACNC, the Charities Commission, against the rules. The rules of the Charities Commission say, and this is before you even get to foreign interference laws, say you cannot have a political purpose. Well, all the AJA and the other, some of the other ones do, is carry on about politics all day. Bad Labor, Greens are evil, Teals are evil Greens, and Labor's anti-Semitic, da 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 da. And only Dutton is at the moment, because he's just taken a straight Netanyahu, pro-Netanyahu position. He's the only good guy at the moment. Now, this espousing of this, using your charity status, and we're subsidising them through the tax system, using that for political reasons is not on. It breaks the rules of the Charities Commission, and yet nobody has done anything about it. And that's what they need to do next. They need to, when they're having their anti-Semitism cabinets, they just need to think a bit laterally and go, well, hang on, if we stopped these guys at the extreme in the Zionist lobby from upsetting everybody, and then perhaps that would help social cohesion. Perhaps there should be some coming together of the Zionists instead of this rigid pro-Israel position on everything. It needs to change, because otherwise people don't like genocide. They don't like seeing, and it's going to start up again. I mean, already the truce has been broken. The terms of the ceasefire, rather. It will just get worse. There has to be a political solution in the Middle East, but also there has to be a more effective solution here. I mean, these guys have got to man up and go and see the Zionist leaders and say to them, you guys are going to have to be more reasonable in the way that, in your demands, because people just don't like it. The Australian public doesn't buy it.
Yeah, no, absolutely spot on. And you mentioned a couple of different things. I guess I'll touch on, but you mentioned with TikTok the ban, and you didn't get to mention that part of the impetus behind why TikTok was banned was because of the proliferation of pro-Palestine content on the platform. Senator Josh Hawley, I believe, from America said so. And I mean that's sort of just one aspect of the blanket media influence that they have. Again, that you mentioned earlier, we look at the Australian context and we see with Murdoch and his media empire that Murdoch is a close personal friend of Netanyahu himself. We can also look back a little bit further. We can see Kerry Packer, who again was a rabid Zionist as well. So it's at all levels. And I mean, it wasn't so long ago that we saw an ABC journalist kicked out for really not a major transgression. It's really quite arbitrary, the fact that she supported Palestine on a platform which is generally regarded to be quite progressive on all other stances. I mean, it's the ABC. I don't know, maybe you take a different perspective, Michael, but from my side of politics, we generally see the ABC being very left wing on a lot of issues, but then it comes to this, and suddenly they're treading the Zionist line. I know you've mentioned before, or it might have been John Menadue, a fellow independent journalist, along with yourself, who mentioned the influence of the AIJAC in media coverage. For example, they lobby even the biggest media companies to change various even like crosswords, but also media coverage of Israel in order to make it suit their favor. Who are the key players, can I ask you, that are influencing Australia's media coverage of not just Israeli and Jewish affairs abroad, but also here in Australia as well?
Well, the way that it works, well, just on the ABC briefly, you make a good point. Just stepping back one thing, the other tactic has been to make it a left versus right issue. And I actually did a piece with the other day with somebody on TNT radio who's a right winger, and I'm pretty progressive. We're opposite ends. We were in furious agreement the whole time. I think this is the problem with identity politics, and making genocide a left versus right issue is just not right. But you've got a lot of dummies out there that are in either that feel as though they've got to be part of whatever tribe.
Well,
But
not
that
to
has
cut
been
you off,
very
but I can
successful.
absolutely affirm that. I mean,
Yeah.
myself, I'd say I'm from a quite a conservative perspective, and absolutely everything is pretty much dominated by the pro-Israel message. Mentioned Peter Dutton. I mean, why has a candidate for the prime minister, the highest office in Australia, talking about Israel, making that such a central issue of his campaign? It really makes me wonder. And I mean,
That's a very simple one, John. There's one reason for that, and that's
yeah, the
because
donor.
because News Corp backs him to the hilt. So
Well,
the
that of
News
course.
Corp whole thrust for the campaign for Dutton is to, whatever it is, if you're talking with nuclear energy or whatever, it's all pro Dutton. So Sky News, so the right wing media backs him to the hilt, and they're very ardently in favour of Israel, and Murdoch always has been. He's always been a massive Zionist, and we can speculate as to reasons for that, but he is absolutely ridiculously pro-Israel. I mean, his coverage has just, well, the entire media's coverage has been disgraceful, but his coverage has just been shrill and hysterical propagandizing for the right wing of Zionists, not even the reasonable ones who just, the old style. We're talking the neo-Zionists, if you like, the old style that just believe that Israel should exist and that they back Israel. I mean, that has moved on. Zionism has sort of evolved into this, where we have to back them at all costs thing. It's really quite damaging. But Dutton knows where his bread's buttered politically. He does what Murdoch tells him to do. And Murdoch backs him to the hilt and wants to get him into office. That's the reason Dutton is. I mean, the votes aren't there because there's 100,000 Jews compared to 400,000 Muslims or whatever the numbers are, but it's 4-1. So Labor's sensitive to the Western Sydney seats, obviously, where it might, because the Muslims and the Arabs, they're fed up with it because they don't have a voice, and they're very upset about what's going on in the Middle East, rightfully so. And they're very upset because they can't get a voice politically or media-wise. So, but that explains it. But when you get to the ABC, now your point, no, I don't know what the ABC would really is very left anymore. It's certainly that's what's promoted if you watch Sky News, but the ABC's problem is a unique one because it's a government agency, effectively, or government corporation. And they have this internecine, this very complicated internal complaints process, like any government organisation. And so if you're in the news game, you've got to put out stories daily. You've just got to churn out content. I mean, editors and producers don't have much time on their hands. They're busy with the news cycle. If they get a complaint and the complainant is pesky and soaks up their time, a lot of it in the media is self-censorship because they go, we know we're going to get complaints here, so we'll just give it a miss. We'll go the easy path. So a lot of it is that. There's self-censorship at the ABC. Now, my mate John Lyons, who's the long time, he even worked for News Corp at one point, John. I don't know how he managed to stay there so long as a Jerusalem correspondent at News Corp, because he is a first-rate, very good investigative journalist. He used to be editor at the Herald back in the day, but he's the correspondent over there, and he's been in Israel and Lebanon, throughout the Middle East. And he came out basically and had a crack at his own corporation, the ABC itself, over being too pro-Israel. So he would not have been able to do that unless he was a very senior, well-respected journalist. If you're a junior journalist, you can't just get up and just shirt front your management and say this isn't good enough and take them on and go to another media organisation and go on the air. And that's what John did, and that's how critical this whole thing was. I mean, it's a crisis in media. And Paul Barry did a good job, the Media Watch guy. He came back and he basically, back from leave at the end of at the beginning of 2024 last year, and just had a look at the media bias and did actually a very good job. But the problem is, for most journalists and producers they're time poor, they're sensitive to criticism and knowing that they might get a complaint against them for being anti-Semitic, and that's what it is. Because for many years, for generations, if you got a complaint against you for being anti-Semitic, that was it. You lost your job. Look what happened. It's the Jeremy Corbyn effect, and that's what they're all scared of, and that's what the politicians are scared of. They're scared of being labelled anti-Semitic and losing their job. That's the threat, because the Zionist lobby has been relentless in pursuing its political goals, and they will, lose people their jobs. I've spoken to plenty of these. They've come to me. One we published, who was a former journalist called Farah Abdurrahman, Lebanese family originally from Lebanon, but Australian. She lost a job in the New South Wales Public Service after quite a timid, forthright but not particularly tendentious little comment on LinkedIn. So somebody had been scouring all the public servants' posts and outing them to their employers, and she was sacked. She was pushed out of there, as well as getting a nasty story in the Daily Mail where they didn't even ring her and just did a hatchet job on her personally. So her life was just destroyed overnight for a LinkedIn post. And so people are scared to speak out because they'll have myriad complaints, people working in packs to get them to lose their job, pulling their influence, exerting their influence at every level. And that's the kind of thing we're up against. But I do think, and I certainly hope, we've reached peak Zionism, because, it is so destructive. And I don't think the Zionists fully comprehend themselves, because it's slightly narcissistic, that they are doing themselves such grievous damage in just overcooking everything and being unreasonable and making it all about them and their victimhood. They've trashed the memory of the Holocaust, in my view. People now go, and there's all these people out there on social media now questioning the Holocaust, high-profile commentators, because so many lies have been told in this situation over the past year and a half that people are now questioning all these things that they're saying. And so it's been, the damage will endure now for generations, because it's all on tape. This new era of social media, it's completely changed everything. I think they've done themselves incredible damage, and I sincerely hope that it does not. And I'm pleasantly surprised at the moment, John, but I sincerely hope that it does not affect decent Jewish people who don't want to see Palestinians murdered, or anyone murdered, or people bombing Lebanon or Syria or whatever. They just want to see peace in the Middle East, and peace in Australia, indeed, politically. And I certainly hope that anti-Semitism itself doesn't rise. And I'm pleasantly surprised so far. Well, there has been a spate of recent events that we don't know. They're a bit mysterious at this point. But, there's been no physical violence here. There's been no bombs, any of that stuff. I just hope it doesn't turn into, just retribution, where you just get another wave of terrorism, because people have grown up, their families been killed around them, Palestinian or whatever, becoming radicalized, and then, getting involved with terrorism. I just hope it doesn't happen. I mean, so far, it's been pretty good. I've got to say, I'm surprised that there hasn't been any bombings, because, if you look at the Iraq situation, we went to war on a lie there. And arguably, the Bali bombings in 2002, which targeted Australians, because we were, part of the liberation team in Iraq, the Operation Enduring Freedom, or those silly names that they give these things, because we were, and America sort of was overcooking it in the Middle East as usual. The Bali bombings happened, and 200 Australians or more died. And if we weren't in Iraq, we weren't getting involved in other people's wars, then I don't think that would have happened. So I think John Howard's got blood on his hands because of that, decision to take us to war on a lie. Now you can understand it geopolitically a bit because he's got the American alliance that he's got to look to. If you're prime minister, but he didn't act for the safety of the country, in my view. And I just hope this situation right now does not spawn another wave. And so far, Muslim minorities around the world and their diasporas have, I think, been pretty good in terms of not engaging in physical violence. I can't even think have there been any Muslims even arrested for graffiti? I'm not sure there have been. These latest two,
None come to mind.
These latest two that were named, Fallujah, the Fallujah woman that was actually named. Well, it's not a Muslim name. She seems like some sort of extremist. I mean, a lot of people got mental health problems. So, but I'm just pleasantly surprised that so far there's been no reprisals of any significance.
Yeah, and something we should be thankful for, especially considering the growing rift, I suppose, within our society. I mean, we have got radically different people living together in close quarters, and with conflicts overseas like this, you can expect the powder keg to erupt if it isn't constantly hosed down by police and by, careful treatment of issues by the media and things like that, which is very unfortunate. But um, I agree with absolutely everything you said in terms of the media coverage, especially you mentioned how a lot of Jews practice hasbara in terms of their treatment of Israel and criticism of it. And we know that there are units within the IDF, such as Unit 8200, which are specifically installed in order to uh, send out pro-Israel propaganda all over social media, really, and imitate real-life accounts of actual people, when in fact they're operated for the precise purpose of spreading propaganda. So it is sort of best to conceive of the Israeli influence on Australian soil as another front, and I suppose on all Western soil, on American especially, as just another front in their war against their enemies. And at the moment, that happens to be Palestine. But of course, we've seen similar criticism of Iran and various other countries as well as a result. But there's a lot to get into. We've discussed a little bit about how the right wing in Australia is in bed with Israel and what the underlying causes of that might be. You mentioned direct involvement from the Israeli government. You mentioned the Murdoch press. But why do you think it is that Albanese, I mean, having once been a founding member of the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine, has also been fairly quiet on the issue of, I suppose, Palestinian suffering? I can imagine that there's intense pressure from within the Labor Party. I mean, we recently saw, I believe her name was Marine Faruqi, leave the party over the issue of Palestine. And I imagine that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the pressure being exerted on the leadership within Labor. Why do you think it is that Albanese did such a heel turn and doesn't really speak out in favor of Palestinian interests and sort of takes a quietist position on Israel?
He's just being a tactician. I mean, Albo was originally very pro-Palestinian. I know people that know him on a personal basis, and he was very, he came from the left of the Labor Party through the right wing of the New South Wales branch, which is, right wing New South Wales Labor. They've dominated the scene here for a long time, like the left have in Victoria in the Labor Party, or had. You don't do that without having very good political judgment. And obviously, you see, he's seen as being very disappointing for the left because they've looked at him and gone, well, you sold out your principles. But what he's doing is trying to keep it together, I think, and just generally politically, he's been going. I mean, he's going well for the first 6 months, despite getting a bit of a hospital pass on the economy, and he just sort of then went. He just went too middle of the road, and in the end, people, the Labor. A lot of the traditional Labor base are disappointed with him for not being visionary enough, like in the way that Hawke and Keating made major reforms. I think it's more difficult these days because of vested interest, and we're up to democracy that everything is lobbied, and the political donations is just a complete racket. So it's more difficult these days to execute significant reform. But Albo, he I think he's just gone to the centre and felt that's where he's got to be. So he's trying to be a sort of a jack of all trades right there in the centre, and not. And unfortunately for him, the Dutton campaign is, well, bold and decisive. This is what News Corp represents him as, and it doesn't matter what he stands for. It's a bit Trumpist, but an Albo is vacillating and weak, and that seems to be working a bit because. So the question is, from the left, does he need to muscle up and be more decisive and try to do the right thing, get back to his roots a bit? I mean, the guy was a far left sort of, DJ in pubs and clubs back in the day. And he was a real radical. So I think when you get into these offices, I mean, who knows until you actually become Prime Minister, the compromises that are on you. But he would have a lot of very powerful vested interests in his ear the whole time. And he would know that he doesn't want to be branded as anti-Semitic. They have, like the AJA and these kind of hysterical ones have, but generally the Zionists haven't painted him as anti-Semitic. They've gone after him and Wong for being weak on Israel. Weak on Israel means you just don't do everything that who wants you to do, like vote with him at the UN, etc. So, but in my view, it would be probably better for him just to come out and expel the Israeli ambassador and say you can come back when you strike a lasting peace deal and you stop murdering Palestinians, because they've just wrapped it up in the West Bank now that they've had a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, it just doesn't seem that there's going to be an end. There's so much hatred on both sides, but particularly this indoctrination, this hatred of this treating Palestinians like animals. Where's that logical, humane view gone that people are people? Like, they might be brought up in different countries and different religions, but ultimately the value of human life should be the same. And unfortunately, they've just lost the bearing on that, and they do treat Palestinians like animals. So it's a terrible, at its core, it's this racist, supremacist nonsense. And it's so toxic now that it's just difficult to see how it's going to end, really. They've got to get rid of the government. That has to go. I mean, it just weakens Israel every week. I don't think social tensions are going to be eased here until there's a resolution over there. Even then, there was this ceasefire has been greeted with great anger by the extremists over here. They're very upset at the pause in their genocide. So I can't see that it just doesn't seem that there's an end to it at the moment, which is incredibly disappointing, because Hamas, you've got to give it to them, the Palestinian resistance has really dug in. I mean, people tend to forget 13% of Gaza were Palestinian Christians. It's higher in the West Bank. There's more higher Muslim quotient down in Gaza, but 13% of Christians. So to brand them all as the same as, toxic Muslims, as the Zionist lobby does, is just highly unfactual as well as toxic.
And we've seen the targeting of church buildings which were harboring people that were, trying to avoid being bombed and things like that, whether accidental or intentional. Regardless, it's pretty abhorrent. It's hard to stomach. But Michael, we're approaching the end of the episode. I suppose I've got two more questions for you if you have time.
Sure.
I suppose one of my questions was, do you think that Albanese fears a tap on the shoulder from Mark Liebler, similar to the case with Rudd? Do you think that the Zionist lobby still exercises that level of power within our government?
I think it must be very uncomfortable for them because Liebler has been, like Gillian Siegel, the anti-Semitism envoy, has just been, with Netanyahu all the way and refusing to accept that Israel has done anything wrong. And I think it must be very hard now. I think, it's getting to the point where the politicians must be able to say to them, guys, look, enough is enough. You've just got to stop backing these guys, and you've got to stop overcooking your, victimhood and stuff like that. You are not victims. You live in a $20 million house in Turak or whatever, wherever Lieber lives. And to carry on, all you're doing is ruining the memory of your ancestors that did go through hardship in the Holocaust. This is the point. The victimhood thing is just totally overcooked, like the rest of the tactics that they've used. But now the big one now is spreading the Arab hate, that all Muslims are bad. That's the quite clear design from all the lobby groups to just point the finger, to create more racial hatred. And of course, Murdoch the Australian ran a story the other day, literally saying in their pages, an op-ed by somebody, I forget who it was, but saying that Gazans were gorillas, they're all animals, and basically saying they all deserve to die. And this kind of racism and religious bigotry, it's so bad, it is just so destructive. And unfortunately, I can't see, frankly, right at the moment, end to it. There will be always darkest before dawn, John. It's one of my favourite sayings because in markets it always seems to be total despair before suddenly it bottoms out and starts rallying again. And I think probably in human life you have these cycles, history's cyclical, but you just can't see it at the moment how it's going to be resolved because the hatred is entrenched on both sides, really entrenched. And there's a lot of money involved as well. Invested interests. So I can't see, but I'm sure that it will be resolved at some point. But Israel's got to sort itself out. It's got to stop. And America has to take a role of leadership. They used to show leadership in world affairs in the past, where they'd have accords and summits and and so on. And this time they've just let this thing drift on until Trump decided to do something about it. And I was pretty impressed, actually. Whether it's going to hold, I doubt it. But, he just, and obviously it's the money. He's just said to Netanyahu, if this is going, you need to wrap it up right now before I get into office. Otherwise, we're going to pull your funding. That's what's happened. They've taken American funding for granted. So America's got blood on its hands. Its authority in the world has declined as a result. It's a disaster for the global rules-based order, John.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't have unlimited time, so I think I'll come to my final question for you, which is, well, I come at things from a Christian perspective. So on the one behalf, I do think that all people have worth, of course, and that what is being done to civilians in Palestine is horrendous. Same with Israeli civilians, for what it's worth. But I also come at things from an Australian nationalist perspective, which says to me that my main concern is for my country. And so, Michael, how do you reckon we can start to get this Israeli fifth column influence out of our politics, out of our media? What does it take to reverse something like that? I mean, you mentioned repealing the charity status for something like the AJA, and that would be a pretty massive step. But what are some other things that could be done, theoretically, to try to free our country of this parasitical influence?
A very good question. Well, it needs leadership. It's as simple as that. It needs leadership, whether it comes from, a government or it comes from the Zionist lobby itself. It needs people to stand up and say what's right and wrong and not just serve political interests and to serve humanity. And I can't see that happening. And the problem with the Zionist community, it is very fragmented. I think the Christian Zionists have been disappointing. I mean, particularly, it's a strong thing in the US, obviously much stronger than it is here. But I think the Christian churches could come out and do more. The Pope's been very good, frankly. He's been excellent, and he's anti-Semitic, obviously. So it needs leadership. It needs, if they're going to have these inquiries and these cabinet meetings and so on. It needs people to be brought into the room saying, well, you need to stop promoting hatred across the registered charity sector. So just can the AJA tomorrow just say, sorry, guys, here's the evidence, you've overcooked it. The media, that's changing so quickly. They've lost their authority. Mainstream media is in what's the word? You know, they're in sort of like hostage mode at the moment, just trying to survive. But it needs political leadership. And to be fair, and this is a good note to end on, John. That has happened within the Jewish community itself. Unfortunately, they're getting bagged by the Zionists, but there's been some very, Louise Adler and Anthony Lowenstein and these people have come at great personal cost to themselves, getting bagged by their own communities, but come out and done the right thing. And internationally, you've got Jeffrey Sachs and Gideon Levy and these guys, fantastic. Just bravely speaking truth to power every day. And in Australia, you've got the rise, the Jewish Council of Australia, the SEDEC Collective, there's Jews for Peace, there's a whole bunch of them. They're coming out and showing some leadership. And the media needs to be interviewing them, not the crackpots, the pro-Israel crackpots. They need to be interviewing younger, more courageous, less, indoctrinated members of the Jewish community who can take responsibility for this. But you're right, you've got to get the foreign interference out. Unfortunately, there's no political will to do that because the foreign interference of Israel in Australia is horrendous. And it could start with the charities. They need to take some strong measures against the charities. That they should kick out the Israel ambassador, recall our ambassador to Israel and say, you've got to sort this thing out. You've got to do peace with the Palestinians or we don't want to know about you. We're going to stop trading with you and so on. Take a principled stand, for goodness sake, because if they don't, they will be regretting it for generations, absolute generations. Because it's all there on record. And we're only it's like the whole world's got PTSD watching this happen.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. For fear of overcooking the episode, I think we'll end it there. And I guess we all hope for a peaceful resolution and for the freeing of hostage Australia, I suppose. So thank you for joining me this episode, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Would you like to just quickly tell everyone where they can find your social media and your publication, of course?
Sure. Well, the umbrella group is Michael West Media. You can just Google Michael West Journalist. That's how you can find it. And on YouTube, we've got the West Report. Got about 90,000 subscribers there. And we're across Instagram, which I don't manage, TikTok, which I don't do enough of, X or Twitter. You can get me there at Michael West Biz, Facebook and LinkedIn. And there's probably a couple of others that I've forgotten, but they're the main ones. And just Google it. And thanks for having me on the show, John. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you. And all the links will be down below in the description. And I highly recommend checking out Michael West Media. I mean, it's probably one of the most comprehensive backlogs of Israeli news in Australia. I mean, from a pro-Australian standpoint. So I definitely recommend checking that out and just going through and reading a little bit about what the Israelis have been up to in our country. So yeah, thank you very much, Michael, and have a great rest of your week.
Good on you, John.